Hello everyone, this is lesson 2 on preparing to write about Macbeth. It's Miss Smith here and I'm going to help you build your notes in preparation for writing an essay about how Shakespeare interests the audience in the first act of the play. So today you're going to be working between this video and the PowerPoint that your teacher sent you, and you should also have been sent some slides that you could print off to make notes on. It's absolutely fine if you want to make notes in your exercise books instead, as long as you're keeping track of what you're thinking. Okay then, so just to start off, we're going to play a quick game just to get your minds going and to get you thinking, okay? So you might want to, for this game, jot down the answers that you think in your notes and then check them against my answers, okay? So this is find them. So on the board then you've got you've got to find 8 settings that are either used as an actual setting that characters are physically placed in Macbeth, or settings that are referred to. Okay, so 8 of them are correct, the other ones are false. Okay, so if you want to pause the video and you can jot down the 8 that you think are correct, and then I'll talk you through the answers. Okay, if you do that now. Okay everyone, so we'll have a go at seeing if we can find the 8 that are correct. Okay, so let's start with the most obvious one. So the battlefield is a correct answer. And a heath, correct answer. So we've got the battlefield and the heath from the very beginning of the play, and the heath obviously where the witches are meeting in that first opening scene. We've got Scotland, haven't we, with a wider setting that Shakespeare uses for the play. And then in contrast with that, we've got England. So a lot of the action of the play, you'll remember from watching it, takes place in Scotland, but it does toward the end of the play move to England. If you remember, Macduff flees to England to go and support Malcolm and raise an army to come back and defeat Macbeth. So you can see already that you've got these 2 big settings that the action moves between, and you can see already that at the very beginning of the play we start with the heath and then move to the action at the events of the battle on the battlefield. So we've got a little bit of movement between settings, and we've got a clear distinction between the heath and the battlefield. So some bit of help there already to help us think about settings that Shakespeare's using at the beginning of the play. We've got 4 left to find. Scone is where Macbeth goes to be crowned king, you'll remember. Okay, we've got a banqueting hall, which again you'll remember from the film. We haven't got to this scene yet in our reading of the play, but you'll remember from the film, this is where Banquo's ghost returns to haunt Macbeth, and Macbeth causes a horrendous scene which reveals his guilt and his very fragile state of mind. Okay, and then we have got woods. Okay. And again, from your work watching the film, you'll remember that the woods that are referenced are Burnham Woods, and Macbeth thinks that he is safe until Burnham Woods removed to Dunsinane, and so he thinks, well, woods can't move. Unfortunately, he finds that they can when the soldiers of the English army hide behind the boughs of the trees and move towards his castle. And then lastly, we've got a witch's cavern, which Macbeth returns to visit the witches. Okay, I'm assuming that you all got those right and you are all perfect at home, so well done. And obviously the other ones are not scenes, not settings that are used for any of the scenes in Macbeth. Okay, so if you got those all right, well done, that's brilliant. If you didn't, that's fine. Just make some changes to your notes now so that you're happy with them. And you might, before you move on, you might want to just pause the video and just jot down anything that I said there that you thought might be useful. Before we move on with the lesson, you might want to do that. Okay, and then when you're ready, we're going to move back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so if you, when I finish speaking, if you go back to the PowerPoint and you pick up the starter activities, which are on slides 2 and 3, and they get you looking at the setting of the castle in a little bit more detail. Okay, so if you do that and then you press play again and come back to the video when you're ready, and then I'll talk you through some of my ideas that I might have jotted down about the setting of the castle. Okay, do that now, please. Okay, so the first setting that you've looked at in detail this lesson asked you to look at Macbeth's, well, to look at the idea of the castle, which obviously we think about in terms of Macbeth's castle. So first of all, I was asking you to think about some of the words that you associate with the castle, and perhaps thinking about what it might symbolise. So we'll sort through these words, and if you've got them, that's great. If you haven't and you want to add them to your notes, please do so. You might have ones that I've not thought of as well, so don't think that you're wrong, because it's all just ideas and interpretation, isn't it? So the first one I'm going to start with is a fortress. So obviously castles have battlements and they have protective elements to them, so they're not meant to be easily gotten into. Okay, they're meant to be impenetrable. Okay, a castle is usually a home to someone as well. Okay, I'm going to move some of these words away because we don't need them just yet. You might think that a castle is kind of a place of luxury. It has connotations of riches and wealth and things like that. To back up this idea of the castle being a fortress, you could think about how a castle's self-contained, and can kind of support itself and protect itself, and those kinds of things. It's quite insular. We don't always know what's going on inside of a castle because of this sort of barrier that's around it. You might also view all of these things as suggesting that a castle is a seat of authority and power, and a place of strength. Some of these words I'm coming back to in a moment. It is made for keeping people out, so therefore it's sturdy. That one. Ideas about wealth. I've used that word already. Insular. It's kind of quite inward looking. It's all about control. Okay. It could be the seat of a battle. It could very much so, because we just talked about the idea of kind of keeping people in and keeping people out. So it could very much be the place of a battle or the place of a siege if you're kind of inside. It's a place of leadership and status and power. I'm grouping all of these words over here because they're kind of connected, aren't they? A place of safety and protection. And it's secure, so I'm kind of going over here because some of these words are things that you would hope for of a home as well. So there's that kind of idea of strength and power and control and government and all of those things that are being suggested over here, but also that idea that it's to do with home. So, you know, these things here about being secure and safe and protected kind of overlap, don't they, with power and what you want at home. Coming back to those ones. Okay, so we've got the kind of two sides to castles in this play then, haven't we? We've got this kind of domestic world, this world of home and the world of family, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and the family of the Macduffs. But also it's very much this idea of it being a place of power and authority and control. And then also a site of battles and sieges. Okay, so then you were asked to have a little look at some of the words that are associated with the depiction of the castle setting of Macbeth's castle in particular, and I've got some of the words that are used at the bottom of the image here, so we'll have a think about those. And this relates to the third slide on the PowerPoint that you were looking at, where you were looking at what Duncan says as he arrives at Macbeth's castle, and then you were looking at some of the words that Banquo and Duncan use to talk about the castle. So let's just strand these ones out a little bit and have a look, and you can see immediately that we've got words that are very positive, aren't they, in their connotations. I'm going to put those ones over there. Okay. Just moving these ones. So we've got all of these very positive words: pleasant, sweetly, delicate, loved, all very positive words there. Obviously heaven's got very positive connotations, and all the words there, nimbly, gently, delicate. There's a sort of softness about the language and the words that are used to describe the castle. Of course, there's a great deal of dramatic irony going on, isn't there, as Duncan arrives at the castle and declares, "This castle hath a pleasant seat. The air nimbly and sweetly recommends itself unto our our gentle senses, he's got it completely wrong there, hasn't he? It's the place where he is going to be murdered, and he'll spend his last night on earth in that castle. So it has all of those grim connotations, and obviously we already are starting to pick up on this plan and the idea that his life will end there. So we can see that it's dramatic irony. Of course, it's not the first time, is it, that Duncan's got things wrong, so we're kind of primed for that already. We've seen already how he's got the first Thane of Cawdor wrong and misunderstood his personality, so he quite often perceives things the wrong way. But of course, we've heard right from the very first scene of the play that this is a play where fair is foul and foul is fair. It's not easy to determine what's good and what's bad in the world of this play, is it? But overwhelmingly, the representation of the castle where Macbeth and his wife live by Duncan is that it's wholly positive. He's looking forward to spending some time there. Okay. As he talks to Banquo about it, they use some interesting words. They talk about the birds that make their nests there, and he talks about the martlet birds that's seen as a bird of summer, and he talks about the idea that, well, they both do, Banquo and Duncan talk about the idea that the birds come and make their nests there. So there's all of these kind of connotations of breeding and procreating there, which is really interesting, particularly for you lot, bearing in mind that last week you heard Niamh Cusack with the RSC talking about her interpretation of Lady Macbeth, and that she sees Lady Macbeth as a woman who has had several miscarriages, and that the Macbeths are a couple who haven't been able to have children and to create the family for themselves that they would want to be able to create. So the idea that the birds are building the nests there, and the idea that this is a kind of place of birth for birds, and that kind of abundance of life there is a real contrast, isn't it? And very ironic, but also sad. And perhaps if we view Lady Macbeth and Macbeth in the way that Niamh Cusack was discussing last week with the RSC, there's a sense of sadness there, and perhaps we can kind of begin to understand the desperation that these two characters might feel. Also, we've got the word haunting, which is used in relation to the temple haunting martlet, but that's a bit of another kind of ominous sense there of the setting. Okay, so there's a few ideas for you about that original depiction of the setting of Macbeth's castle, and some thoughts about the language that he's using. So add any of those ideas that you like and that you think you could write about to your notes, so you don't forget them. As I say, you will have thought of things that I've not thought of, and that's absolutely fine. So don't doubt yourself there, just be confident in those ideas. Okay, so the next thing that you need to do, once you're happy with your notes, is go back to your PowerPoint now. So I think you should be up to slide 4, where you're going to find some instructions about how to make notes using StopSec. So you were reminded about StopSec last lesson. So remember, that stands for settings, time, openings, point of view, shifts, endings and characters, and using StopSec to think about where and how Shakespeare is using those different elements. So you're going to be asked to make some notes using StopSec to help you, and then we'll build on those notes to help you write a really great piece about the opening of the play. So go back to the PowerPoint, follow those instructions, and then press play and come back to me when you've finished, and I'll give you some more ideas to help you. Okay, thank you. Okay, so you should have a sheet similar to this for making your notes on, or you might have been just jotting them down in your exercise book. That's absolutely fine, but I've just borrowed the sheet so I could show you how I might structure my notes and the kinds of things that I might be writing down. Okay, again, I can't guess what you're writing, so please don't think that you're wrong if you've written something from me. You could have some amazing ideas there, so just be confident in your own ideas. I'm just trying to make sure that you've all got some ideas that you could write about and that you can feel confident in. Okay, so I'll talk you through some of the things that I would have been thinking about if I was you doing this at home. Okay, so the first feature of the opening act that I was asking you to look at today was to look at settings. Okay, so we've already played a couple of games and thought about the connotations of particular settings. So what other ones are there in the play and what might they symbolise? Let's have a look. So the first setting that we come to is the Heath, where the witches are at the very beginning of the play. So the thing that's quite interesting about the Heath is it's what we might call a marginal space. Okay, it's on the edges. It's not right in the thick of things. It's not a busy place where everybody is. It's on the edges. Everybody else really is in the battlefield. That's the main setting at the moment, isn't it? And it's going to then move to castles and things like that. But a heath is a kind of edgelands. It's like between two places. Okay, so that's interesting, isn't it? If you think about the witches who themselves are otherworldly, and if we think about what we know about attitudes towards women and the ideas about who might be witches, they weren't people who were fully accepted in society. So they themselves were on the margins, on the fringes, on the edges of things. Okay, so that's the first setting to think about, and it's wild, isn't it? A heath is a big open space, open to the elements. It's wild. It's kind of ungoverned, if you like. Okay, so anything could happen there, and obviously it does. Okay, the next big setting to think about is the battlefield. Okay, so we meet Duncan talking to the captain at the end of the battle, and they're kind of still on the battlefield, so to speak. So that's a symbol of conflict, isn't it? Another word I could have put down there, but I didn't, I forgot. But it's just coming to us now, is it's a place of success, isn't it? They've won the battle, so you could have success there as well. It's also a place of death, it's a place of injury, okay? So it's got positive and negative connotations, but it's quite different from the heath, isn't it? It's a busy place, there's lots going on. Okay, interestingly, the meeting between the witches that takes place on the heath, it's the end of a meeting. Okay, I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment, but they're bringing a meeting to an end, and what's happening on the battlefield is also bringing the battle to an end. So we're beginning with endings. So there's some early points for your openings box, but I'll come back to that in a bit in a minute. Okay. And then we get, I know this isn't a place, I was trying to make it fit all on one magnet, but also I couldn't actually quite decide where they were. But Macbeth's meeting place with the witches, kind of a bit heathland again, it's an open space. Again, so same sorts of things that we were thinking about there, where he meets the witches. It's a marginal space, it's between two places. He's kind of on his way back from battle, isn't he? He's not where he's in between getting to somewhere where he needs to be. Okay, he's on his way to see the king and then onwards to home, and this is sort of in between. So it's that kind of those same ideas about it being a place that's a bit wild, a bit out of control perhaps. Okay, and we get reference to the site of Cawdor's execution. Some versions that you might see will show it, and some don't, but Cawdor's execution is referenced, so that's another place. Duncan's camp. So Duncan isn't quite at his own castle yet. He's got his kind of royal camp set up on the way back from the battle, because obviously he's been kind of involved in that and on the fringes of that all the time. Now Duncan's camp is an interesting place, isn't it? It's obviously not his castle, but it has that royal status, so it's quite an official place. It's a setting that's associated with power and authority, but interestingly it's also a place that kind of sees that punishments have been handed out. They talk about the execution of Cawdor. Is the execution done on Cawdor? And we hear about how the Thane of Cawdor died. So it's a kind of place for the doling out of punishment, but it's also a place for the handing out of rewards. And Duncan is praising people. He can't speak highly enough about Macbeth, and he is making sure that everybody knows that his son is next in line to the throne. So it's a place of royalty, it's a place of high status, but it's also a place where Duncan is trying to, now that the battle's over, get things into some sort of sense of order. Okay, and then the next main setting is Macbeth's castle, which we've talked about already a little bit, so you've probably got plenty of ideas. But again, the idea that that's home for him, and it's a place that, if you think about home, it should be a place of safety and security and love. But it's going to become a place of murder, and it'll become a place for Macbeth of insecurity, won't it? So as the play goes on, we'll see that develop. Okay, so you can see the key settings there sort of laid out for yourself, and you can see that one thing that Shakespeare is doing in the first act of the play is moving between settings quite a lot, isn't he? Which will interest the audience because we're having to keep up with him. We're trying to make sense of where everybody is and what the action is. And you can see that he's kind of moving between these kind of otherworldly marginal spaces, and things where things are ending, coming to an end, where transitions are happening, to more regal royal places, but it's all moving towards Macbeth getting home. Okay, so the whole act is building towards this really important setting of Macbeth's castle, where the main action of the play will take place in the sort of final scenes of Act One and into Act Two. That's going to get everything up and running and really kind of start the play, the tragedy of the play developing. Okay, so loads of ideas there for you about settings. You might want to pause the video for a moment now just to make sure that you've got everything written down in your notes that you want, or if you need to play anything back, and then pick up again when you're ready and we'll look at ideas about time. Okay, so with time, we could be talking about things like the day or the night time setting. We could be talking about the season. We could be talking about a particular hour that something's happening. We could be talking about whether or not there's flashbacks and flash forwards and things like that, and use of time as a device. Okay, we're thinking about the kind of more medieval world of the play, but we're also thinking about the fact that it was written during Jacobean times. So there's all of those kinds of things that are going on. Okay, so I'm going to use the word when because it's interesting. When is the play set? But also the very first word of the play is when. When shall we three meet again? But so time is marked immediately out as being very important. And I know that the version of Macbeth that the RSC were talking about last week, time's hugely important in that version of the play, and they have a clock counting down to Macbeth's death on there, and that's present on stage throughout the whole play. So time's hugely important. So there's a lot of uncertainty about time though, really, isn't there? Because we don't know what day it is. We don't know whether or not it takes place over consecutive days, if there's gaps. There's clearly in the opening act a passage of days, but we're not entirely sure about what that is. It's a bit fluid time in the first stages of the play. But we do know that it's the end of a battle. Perhaps it is summer, we don't know that, but just with the reference to those birds that I was talking about before, that they're present at Macbeth's castle as Duncan and Banquo arrive, that might suggest that it is summertime, which is interesting in terms of the connotations that summer has, that idea of kind of being in your prime of life and that things are going well and it's a kind of wonderful period, which is obviously going to come to a dramatic end for Duncan really quickly, and ultimately for Macbeth as well. Okay, other things to be thinking about in terms of time in the first act is there's a lot of movement. We talked about that before in relation to the different settings and the movement between them, but also Macbeth makes a really fast journey home to his castle, isn't he, to his wife, and that kind of moves us along really quickly. So there's a pace to the opening of the play that we can think about. By the end of the act, it seems to be set more towards evening time when Duncan's arrived at Macbeth's castle, and they're entertaining him as well as plotting his murder. So it's certainly, we've got a passage of days, we've got a passage of time, we've got quite a lot of things happening. We've got the endings of the battle, perhaps the summertime, and we've got the evening in Macbeth's castle. Okay, so some things there for you to think about. And there is also, in terms of time, structurally, we've got lots of foreshadowing and hints of tragedy, haven't we? And hints that things are going to turn out badly. We've also got, in terms of the witches, to think about what their insight into time is. And that Macbeth and Banquo kind of talk about whether or not the witches can tell them more about what's going to happen in the future, and we don't know whether or not the witches do have any control over time. or whether they just kind of are finding out things as they go. I mean, they don't know that much more than us, do they? When they say that they're going to meet Macbeth, they're kind of thinking forward into time, but they're not really suggesting that they know anything more than us. And when they pronounce their 3 predictions to Macbeth, that he'll be Thane of Glamis, well, he already is, and people know that. And when they say he's going to be Thane of Cawdor, we already know that the previous Thane of Cawdor has been found to be a traitor. So we know that as well. So there's some interesting things going on with time there. The other one, though, is whether or not Macbeth will be king, and we don't know about that, and we don't know how time is going to unfold to see whether or not that comes true. Okay, so some things to think about there in terms of the actual use of time, but also that you could start thinking about how the witches kind of can see into the sands of time or not. Okay, again, you might want to pause to jot down some notes and then press play again when you're ready to think about the opening. Okay, so I just said before the play begins with that word when shall we 3 meet again? Okay, so that's interesting because it just reminds us about how important time is, and that it sort of creates a sense of urgency, doesn't it? But if you remember, I said to you before, it opens with this meeting on the Heath with the witches, and it doesn't open with Macbeth, it opens with those witches, so it kind of privileges them and places them at the forefront of our mind for a spell. But I think it's important that where we are joining the witches at the end of a meeting, or the end of a discussion that they've had. They're bringing their meeting to a close. When shall we 3 meet again? You don't say that usually at the beginning of an encounter with someone. You say that after you've already had a conversation. So we don't know what those witches have already been talking about, what they've been planning. This is the end of their meeting, and all we can know is that they are planning to meet again, and that they are going to meet Macbeth. And that is our first mention of the tragic hero of the play. Okay, so it's interesting that Shakespeare chooses not to start with the tragic hero, but he starts with witches, who are very clearly, particularly to the original audience, a symbol of wickedness and evil, and a symbol of outsiders. And so that kind of sets the tone, doesn't it, for the play, which is important for us to think about. Move those up there as well. Okay, and the other thing to think about is what they say. That idea of fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. It conjures this image of darkness and foreboding and a sense of uncertainty. So the play starts at the very beginning scene in this really dark, dismal, threatening setting, which has connotations of evil and wickedness, and this sense of ambiguity about what's good and what's bad in the world of this play. And already from these very early opening lines, alerting the audience to the fact that things can't be taken at face value. Something that might seem good could be wicked, and the other way around. So we can't trust anything. We can't trust these witches. We can't trust Macbeth. We fear for Macbeth because he's aligned with them, and we hear them speaking about him, so that's not a good sign at all. But we don't really know where to place our trust here, and we're being told that nothing is as it seems, and this is a real key indicator early on that the theme of appearance versus reality is going to be prevalent in this play, and we should be looking out for it. Okay, so hopefully some ideas there to get you thinking. As I said before, you've probably got lots of other things on your notes sheet that I've not mentioned. That doesn't mean they're not right. I'm sure they are. Just have a think about them a little bit more and be confident when you're writing about them. But I hope I've given you all some things to talk about and some things to think about there that you can use later on this week when you come to do some writing. Okay, I'll be back next lesson with some more ideas for you. Thanks very much.